By 1810, a single Welsh seaport produced almost 3/4 of all the copper in the world. 90% of Britain's copper was smelted within a 20-mile radius of Swansea. The ore came first from Cornwall, then from Cuba, then from Chile, and finally from Australia, sailing halfway around the globe to feed the furnaces in the lower Swansea Valley. It made the town extraordinarily rich. It also made it uninhabitable. For more than a century, a yellow-grey cloud of sulphur and arsenic hung over Swansea, killing every tree for miles, poisoning the soil and slowly choking the very workers who built the empire. The hills around the valley turned black. Crops withered in the fields. Children grew up never having seen green leaves on their own street. This is the story of how Britain's wealthiest industrial town became its most poisoned. This is the story of Copperopolis. Before the smoke, there was the sea. Swansea sits on a sweeping bay along the south coast of Wales, where the River Tar empties into the Bristol Channel. For most of its history, it had been a quiet medieval port town, a place of fishermen and small traders, of stone houses and the slow tides of an older world. Travellers described a bay so beautiful that it was sometimes compared to the Bay of Naples. But beneath the soil around Swansea lay something that would change everything. Coal, vast accessible seams of bituminous coal, running close to the surface, easy to mine, easy to move and easy to burn at the high temperatures that copper smelting demanded. It took roughly 3 to 4 tons of coal to smelt a single ton of copper ore. In the early 1700s, copper smelters faced a simple economic question. Should they ship the coal to the ore or the ore to the coal? The mathematics gave them only one answer: bring the ore to the coal. In 1717, a Cornishman named Dr. John Lane established the first copper works at Landor, just upriver from Swansea. He was joined within a decade by Robert Morris and other investors, men who saw what the coal fields of South Wales could become. By the 1740s, Welsh smelters had perfected a method that would later be called the Welsh process, an efficient new way of refining copper using mineral coal as fuel. It produced volumes of metal that the old smelting centres of Saxony and Sweden could scarcely imagine. Swansea did not invent copper smelting. What it invented was copper smelting at industrial scale, and the world was beginning to demand it. The Royal Navy needed copper sheeting to clad the hulls of its warships, to keep barnacles from slowing them and shipworms from destroying them. Merchant fleets needed it too. Every cooking pot, every coin, every brass instrument in the rising empire would, sooner or later, pass through Welsh hands. By the late 1700s, Swansea was no longer a fishing town, it was becoming a furnace. In 1810, the Cornish entrepreneur John Vivian leased a tract of land at Hafod on the banks of the Tar and built what would become the largest copper works in the world. The Hafod Copper Works was different from anything that had come before it. Vivian planned it not as a collection of small furnaces, but as a single integrated industrial complex, designed from the outset to expand. By 1886, his sons would employ 3,000 people across their Swansea operations, with 1,000 of them working at Hafod alone. The site eventually operated 95 reverberatory furnaces, the great brick chambers in which copper ore was roasted, smelted and refined. And the numbers from those furnaces are almost difficult to believe today. In 1810, the Swansea district produced around 65,000 tonnes of copper, roughly 72% of the world's supply. By 1820, Wales as a whole was responsible for more than half of global copper output. By 1823, 10,000 of Swansea's 15,000 residents were directly supported by the copper industry. The town set the world price of the metal. Buyers from Hamburg, from Boston, from Bombay watched the boards in Swansea to know what their cargoes were worth. By 1883, within a 5-mile radius of the town centre, there stood 36 collieries, 8 ironworks, 6 tin works, 3 steel works, and 12 copper works. 124 industrial sites in total, crammed into a single river valley. The men who ran this empire became some of the wealthiest in Wales. The Vivians, originally from Cornwall, built mansions and bought titles. Henry Hussey Vivian, would in time be raised to the peerage as the first Baron Swansea. The Morrises gave their name to the suburb of Morriston, a planned industrial village laid out for the workers of their copper enterprises. The Williamses, the Fosters and the Lockwoods built dynasties on smoke and slag. When the Cornish ore began to run out in the 1820s, Swansea did not slow down. It went global. Ships known as Cape Horners began to round the southern tip of South America, ploughing the brutal seas off Tierra del Fuego to reach the Chilean ports of Valparaiso and Coquimbo. 1 in 20 of these ships never came back. The Cape Horn route became a graveyard of Welsh masts, but the ones that returned came laden with the ore that fed the furnaces. Cuba sent shipments. Australia sent shipments, Africa sent shipments. The Swansea moment, as historians would later call it, became the first globally integrated, heavy industry the world had ever seen. And every ton of that ore, when it was finally cracked open in the furnaces of the Tawi Valley, gave up something else along with the metal, something invisible, something the wind would carry for miles in every direction. They called it the copper smoke. It was not really one substance, but a thick chemical fog, dense with sulfur dioxide, sulfuric acid, arsenic, cadmium, and the white oxide of zinc. When the furnaces were lit, which was almost always, it rolled out of the great brick stacks and settled across the lower Swansea Valley in a kind of permanent yellow-grey twilight. In 1794, a traveller named Robert Clutterbuck passed through the area on a tour of Wales. He recorded what he saw with the dry shock of a man who had no language yet for what was happening. Near Swansea, he wrote, there are extensive works both of copper and iron, from the malignant influence of which every trace of vegetation in the neighbourhood has, from a very short period after their erection, been totally annihilated in 1794. And the industry was only just beginning. By the 1820s, the hills around the valley, places like Kilvey Hill and White Rock, had been stripped of grass, of bracken, of the rough scrub that covered every other hillside in Wales. The soil itself had been chemically scorched. Even when seeds were carried in on the wind, nothing would grow. Photographs from a century later show a landscape that looks more lunar than Welsh, a country of slag heaps and bare earth where the only colour was the dark brick of the chimneys. The contamination travelled with the prevailing winds. Farmers in the surrounding parishes reported their crops failing in odd, patchy patterns, following the trail of the smoke. Livestock developed deformities. Sheep grazing on the affected hills sickened and died. The waters of the Nanty Fendrod, the stream that ran through the lower valley, ran orange and oily, drained of fish, carrying the runoff from the waste tips into the River Tau and out to sea. In 1819, the great scientist Michael Faraday visited Swansea to study the problem. He returned in 1822 and again in 1848. By his own description, the works produced a dense plume of sulphur and arsenic smoke up the valley. The seaside town that had once been compared to the Bay of Naples, he noted, had been almost ruined as a resort, its bathing places fouled by the chemical air. A prize of £2,000 was offered to anyone who could solve the problem of the copper smoke. No one could. The smelters tried taller chimneys, hoping to send the smoke higher, but this only carried the poison further. They tried different furnace arrangements. They consulted Sir Humphrey Davy. They consulted Faraday himself. Nothing worked. The sulphur was inherent to the ore. To make the copper, you had to release the smoke. And so the smoke went on. If the smoke was killing the land, the question that haunts the story is what it was doing to the people. In the streets of Hafod and Morriston, in the company houses laid out beside the great works, lived the families who tended the furnaces. They were Welsh, Irish, Cornish, and increasingly drawn from across the rural counties of South Wales. They worked in conditions of intense heat, breathing air thick with metal vapour, in shifts that often ran 12 hours or longer. In 1854, a Swansea physician named Dr. Thomas Williams published a remarkable book. He called it Report on the Copper Smoke and the Industrial Diseases of Coppermen. It was one of the first serious medical investigations of industrial air pollution in the world. Williams catalogued what he saw in the wards and the streets. The coppermen had a particular look about them, a sallowness of the skin, a hollow quality around the eyes. They suffered from chronic cough, from chest pain, from inflammation of the airways that worsened with every year at the furnace. Many of them, in time, began to cough up blood. They were diagnosed with what the Victorians called consumption, the catch-all term for the wasting respiratory diseases of the age. Modern medical understanding tells us what Williams could only glimpse. Sustained exposure to high concentrations of sulfur dioxide causes respiratory failure, scarring of the lungs, and severe cardiovascular strain. Arsenic, absorbed through the lungs and skin, is a slow poison and a carcinogen. Cadmium destroys the kidneys. The men of the lower Swansea Valley were absorbing all three every working day, for as long as their bodies could stand it. The farmers of the surrounding country tried to fight back. From the 1830s onwards, a series of lawsuits were brought against the copper smelters by landowners whose crops had failed and whose tenants had abandoned their farms. The Great Copper Trials, as they came to be known, dragged through the courts for decades. The evidence was overwhelming. The smoke was killing the land, but the law of the time was poorly equipped to deal with industrial pollution at this scale, and the smelters had something the farmers did not. They had the wealth of half the world's copper trade behind them, and they had lawyers. In an 1878 Royal Commission, called specifically to investigate the smoke, Henry Hussey Vivian appeared as a witness. He spoke at length about the employment Swansea provided, about the wages, about the prosperity. He dismissed the farmers' complaints. He denied any clear effect on human health. The Commission produced its report. The government took no meaningful action. The smoke went on. The mansions of the Vivians filled with paintings and silverware. The hills of Kilvey stayed bare, and in the streets below the coppermen kept coughing. In the end, what the courts could not stop, geography did. By the 1880s, the world was changing around Swansea. New copper deposits had been discovered in places like Montana, Arizona, and the high deserts of northern Chile. The economic logic that had once made Swansea unbeatable now ran the other way. It was cheaper to smelt copper near the mines than to ship the ore halfway around the world. The great American copper companies built their own smelters. The Chileans built theirs, the Australians built theirs, and one by one the furnaces of the lower Swansea Valley began to grow cold. The decline was slow, painfully so. The Vivians and the other portfolio capitalists tried to diversify. They moved into silver and lead refining. They built chemical works, alkali works, phosphate works, and tin plate mills. Some of them succeeded for a time, but the great age of Welsh copper was over. By the early 20th century, the works were closing one after another. By the 1920s, what had once been the metallurgical centre of the world was a dying industrial corpse, and the corpse did not decompose cleanly. The closing of the furnaces did not end the pollution, it simply left the wreckage standing. By the middle of the 20th century, the lower Swansea Valley had become what one official report would later describe as the most derelict industrial landscape in Britain. Hundreds of acres of slag heaps, whole tracts on which not a single blade of grass would grow, ruined chimneys, collapsing sheds, contaminated streams, soil so saturated with arsenic and heavy metals that nothing could take root. When trains carried passengers into Swansea in the 1950s, the first sight of the city from the railway window was this: a black, bare, almost lifeless valley lying at what one writer called Swansea's front door. The wealth had gone elsewhere, the smoke had blown away. What remained was the soil, and the soil remembered everything. Visitors and writers compared the valley to Mordor, the blasted country of Tolkien's imagination. It was by then one of the few real places in Britain that genuinely deserved the comparison. The reckoning began in 1961. That year, the Nuffield Foundation, the Welsh Office, and the local authority commissioned a survey of the derelict land of the lower Swansea Valley. The work was carried out by what was then University College of Swansea, and it became known as the Lower Swansea Valley Project. It was, in its time, one of the most ambitious environmental reclamation programmes ever attempted in Britain. For the first time, the full scale of what Copperopolis had left behind was measured and mapped. Soil samples were taken. Plant ecologists, including Dr. R.L. Weston, began planting trials directly into the slag heaps, attempting to find species that could tolerate the toxic ground. Pulverized fuel ash was layered onto the dead earth. Sewage sludge was used as a kind of slow medicine for the soil. Seeds were sown and resown. Some of them, against all expectation, began to take. The final report, published in 1967, recommended that the entire derelict area be acquired by a single authority, in this case Swansea Council, and reclaimed as a whole. From that point on, slowly, the valley began to come back. Land was levelled, a flood prevention scheme was introduced, new roads were laid. By 1971, the project was demolishing the last of the smaller industrial ruins. The very last copper rolling mills, the final operating remnants of the Hafod Morpher works, closed for good in 1980. Where slag heaps had once stood, modern industrial estates appeared. Where the Nanty Fendrod had run orange, walking trails and cycle paths now follow the rivers. Where there had once been nothing but smoke and ash, the Liberty Stadium now stands, home to Swansea City Football Club, whose kit by no accident carries the white and copper of the works that built the city. Trees grow again on Kilvey Hill, birds nest in the valley. The contamination in places has been buried and in other places remains, deep beneath the new soil, a silent inheritance. The Hafod Morpher Copper Works, the great central engine of the empire, still stands in part. Parts of it are listed buildings, Grade 2 protected, preserved by KDW, Swansea Council and a series of heritage trusts. There are plans for restaurants, for housing, for a whisky distillery whose stills, by a quiet historical irony, are designed by Dr. David Faraday, the great-great-grandson of Michael Faraday, who once tried and failed to solve the copper smoke. Visitors walk through the ruins now. They read the information boards. They learn about John Vivian, about the Welsh process, about the ore ships from Chile and the workers in the furnaces. The boards are accurate. They are also, in their way, quieter than the truth. The truth is that for nearly 200 years, one small valley in South Wales bore an industrial weight that no place was meant to bear. The wealth of empires passed through here. So did the suffering of farmers, of livestock, of children, and of the men who breathed the smoke until it killed them. The land paid, the river paid, the people paid, and eventually, slowly, the bill came due. Swansea today is a beautiful city again. The bay is clean, the hills are green. It is possible, walking the modern waterfront on a clear Welsh afternoon, to almost forget what was here. But the valley remembers. The valley always remembers. If this story moved you, there are others waiting beneath the surface of every British city we will visit on this channel. The empires beneath the pavements, the costs paid in lives and landscapes for the world we now inhabit. Stay with us. There is more buried beneath your feet than you know.